Hi there everyone, Mychal Bryan here from the Oraculos School of Astrology, and today we're starting a brand new series on the planets in astrology. So what I wanted to do was come out with a series on the actual movers and shakers from an astrological perspective. And from an astrological perspective, the movers and shakers within our astrology are the planets. When we think about the zodiac, traditionally speaking, when we translate the word zodiac to English, what we end up with is this idea that the zodiac is representing temples of living creatures. And in my first book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, I speak about how we tend to think that the animals that the various zodiacal signs represent and the people that the various zodiacal signs represent, like the Virgin in Virgo or the water bearer in Aquarius, we tend to think that those are the living creatures or the living beings that the zodiac is meant to be a temple for. But when we think about the way how Western astrology is constructed, the only living creatures within our Western astrological framework are the planets. The planets represent the movers and shakers of all things astrological. Today, within the 21st century, we tend to have this idea that the signs of the zodiac somehow have an intrinsic nature and an intrinsic quality that allow the signs to be capable of doing things. And even the most well-intentioned traditional astrologer still makes the error of saying Aries rules the head and Taurus ruled the neck, when in fact, traditionally speaking, the signs of the zodiac cannot rule anything, because the signs of the zodiac do not represent motive forces within the universe. All the signs of the zodiac represent is wallpaper. Jean-Baptiste Morin de Villefranche in the 17th century is noted for having said that if we were to take the portion of the sky that we call Aries and completely obliterate that portion of the sky so that it just returns to being empty space, Mars, as the ruler of the sign Aries, will still essentially be able to carry out its functions, because Mars is representing a primal causer or a source of primal causation, whereas the sign Aries itself isn't capable of doing or causing or ruling anything. Conversely, if we were to destroy Mars as a specific planet, then both the signs Aries and Scorpio would lose all of their intrinsic value and they would lose all of their intrinsic properties, because the living universal life force energy that exists within the signs Aries and Scorpio doesn't exist within them independent and hermetically sealed within their bodies, but it exists within them as a result of the planet Mars being the ruler of those signs. And if we were to destroy Mars as the ruler of those signs, we would essentially destroy anything of intrinsic value that we derive from the signs of Aries and Scorpio collectively. So this idea is meant to emphasize the fact that the planets themselves are representing the primary sources of causation within our larger Western astrological philosophy. The signs are representing a backdrop. The signs are representing a background or a field within which the planets are having their various conversations with each other, and a field within which we can measure the level of planetary potency that any planet specifically has. The signs of the zodiac modulate the planets insofar as the signs of the zodiac either increase that which a planet represents in terms of the intrinsic nature of that planet, or the signs of the zodiac diminish that which the planets represent in terms of their intrinsic nature. Today, within the 21st century, we speak about the signs as the signs being an independent causal force. You are this way because you are a Leo. You are this way because you are a Taurus. You are this way because you are a Cancer. When in fact, from a traditional astrological perspective, we would say you are this way because you have Mars conjunct your first house cusp in a square relationship with Saturn, in a trine relationship with Jupiter, and with the sun in opposition to that Mars. That is more representing why you are the way you are, as opposed to you being this way because you are having your natal sun within a particular sign of the zodiac, or even because you're having a particular sign of the zodiac rising on the cusp of your ascendant. As we look within the backdrop, or as we look within our historical understanding of astrology, and particularly natal astrology, we see this understanding of ourselves as being combinations of stellar influences. And this idea that each and every one of us are combinations of stellar influences is something that has far more nuance when we think about ourselves as being the expression of a life told in planetary terms, as opposed to when we think about ourselves as being a particular sign of the zodiac. So, today I want to go into discussing what the various planets mean, and also where the planets derive their intrinsic nature, because all of this has been laid out for us by the ancients. And one of the beauties of traditional astrology is that all of these concepts in traditional astrology are hermetically sealed, meaning there is nothing more to add to our understanding of Saturn and how and why Saturn is the way Saturn is, because that has already been outlined for us by our astrological ancestors. A lot of the modification and a lot of the modernization that we find today within modern astrology, it occurred within a period of time before we had actually done the titanic task of retrieving from our past this insight into why the planets are the way they are, why astrology is the way it is. So yes, of course, certainly, people made things up within the 60s, the 80s, the 90s, and even earlier within the 20th century, because there was this feeling or there was this understanding of us needing to fabricate for astrology a philosophy that we, as far as we knew, did not exist. However, the philosophical heart of astrology has always existed. The metaphysical heart of astrology has always existed, and it exists deep within the fabric of our understanding of the Western mystery tradition. It exists deep within our understanding of the founding of what we call the metaphysics of Western philosophy. And these are some of the things that I try to bring to the forefront of my own astrological teaching. And to a very large degree, these are the topics that I've spent a great deal of time talking about within my book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, because I feel the more understanding we are, or the more understanding we have of our classical ideas and philosophy about how our astrological cosmos is constructed, the more we actually have the ability to practice astrology in a more robust way. And that sense of practicing astrology in a more robust way, it doesn't just mean that we feel more bold about what we're saying, but it means that we feel ourselves being connected to something older than the hills. We feel ourselves being connected to a body of ancestral wisdom, and we don't have the pressure on ourselves of having to try to make something up, because we realize that everything that we could possibly make up about the why of astrology has already been pre-established by our astrological forebears. So today we're going to dive into this topic of the planets and get an understanding of how the planets derive their intrinsic meaning, also understanding the glyphs of the planets and how the glyphs of the planets speak towards our metaphysical understanding of what the planets are and how the planets operate. And ultimately, we're going to be speaking about how these planets manifest their potencies within a 3D physical reality. Now, one of the things that I enjoy about the planets is that within Jyotish or Indian astrology, the planets are called the grahas. And within yoga philosophy, there is this concept of aparigraha. And aparigraha is the concept of non-grasping or non-covetousness or non-clinging on to life, essentially. Because graha means to cling, to grasp, to hold on to. And just this word, graha, from a Jyotish perspective is so powerful in describing what the planets are and how the planets function from a traditional astrological perspective that I'd like to take some time elaborating on that. Graha means to grasp, to cling, to hold on to. And there is this thought within astronomy, or one of the philosophies that we find within astronomy regarding the planets themselves, is that the planets first exist as wells of cosmic potency within the universe. And these specific wells of cosmic potency, they attract onto themselves the material substance necessary for us to be able to say, there in the sky is that specific planet. So before the planet exists as a physical, corporeal entity within the sky, we have this idea that the planet first exists as a well of magnetic cosmic potency, and that well of magnetic cosmic potency has a gravitational pull that grasps onto itself substance and materials from the surrounding universe that are in conformity with that well of cosmic potency. And as a result of that grasping, we can look into our night sky and identify the material bodies of the planets within the sky. However, independent of that invisible well of inertia and cosmic gravity, the planets themselves would not exist. Because the birth of the planets isn't that the planets are born as material entities. The birth of the planets is that the planets are first born as energetic beings. And in astrology, when we speak about the planets, what we're referring to isn't the physical body of the planets themselves. What we're referring to is this primordial ground of being in terms of the planets representing well springs of magnetized cosmic potency. So in my book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, I speak about how all of the planets magnetize unto themselves certain qualities or certain characteristics from its surrounding universe, but how, from a metaphysical perspective, the planets are also magnetizing unto themselves certain qualities and certain characteristics of our physical world and of our internal psychological processes while we live in this world. So astrologically speaking, when we talk about the fact that you have Mars doing such and such a thing within your chart, it doesn't matter what the physical body of that planet is doing. And furthermore, it doesn't even matter what our proximity is to that physical planet. When we look at a chart, what we're looking at is the combination of these well springs of cosmic potency and how those well springs of cosmic potency concretely define and describe the events and the circumstances that occur within our material world. So that has to be the beginning point of our astrology. Very often, astrologers, as a means of appeasing the scientific community, we try to figure out how can we describe things in a more astronomical way. So when the scientists throws at us that we are more likely to be impacted by our own atmosphere than we will ever be impacted by the rays of Pluto so far away from the physical body of our planet Earth, we were never speaking about the physical body of Pluto to begin with, in just as much the same way as we were never speaking about the physical body of Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, or the Moon. We have always, as astrologers, been speaking about the ways in which the planets, the physical planets themselves, represent non-physical principles, and how those non-physical principles have their life told, or how those non-physical principles have their expression within our material world through the material body of the 7 classical planets. However, from an astrological perspective, even if there were no physical body of the 7 classical planets, the potency of those planets would still exist insofar as that wellspring of cosmic potency that exists at the core of every planet can never be destroyed. So, in the Corpus Hermeticum, which is the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus, we find it being said that nous, God, being male and female, beginning as life and light, gave birth by the word to another nous, the creator of the world. He, being the God of fire and air, formed 7 powers who encompass in their circles the sensory world, and the governance of these powers is called destiny. Hermes isn't telling us that God created 7 balls of rock, and that those 7 balls of rock are the governors of destiny. Hermes is telling us that God, Nous, the mind of the eternal, created 7 powers. Now, when we refer to power, we're not referring to something that we can possibly tangibly see. We're not referring to something that has a corporeal form. We're not referring to the physical structure of a generator, but we're referring to the power that exists within that generator. So when Hermes says to us that God created or formed 7 powers who encompass in their circle this material world, and that the governance of these powers is called destiny, he's referring to something non-tangible. And from our 3D perspective, these 7 governors are held within the bodies of the physical planets of Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon. But if they were to divest of themselves that physical clothing that they wear, they would still exist. And this has to be our starting point from an astrological perspective, not this idea that our proximity to Mars is what allows Mars to have an impact on us, but more so from this idea that we exist within a world and we exist within a universe of cosmic potencies and cosmic potential. And that universe of cosmic potencies and cosmic potential is always in dialogue with itself. And any ripple that occurs within that universe of cosmic potencies and cosmic potential will be felt throughout the entire expanse of that morphic field. And insofar that we on this planet Earth are a part of this morphic field of cosmic potential, we are just as impacted by the movers and the shakers of human destiny, which we call the planets. Now, before we dive into the planets, within the Corpus Hermeticum, we're also told that the human being, or that the human soul, descends through the 7 stellar shells as a willing act of discovering the world of matter. And within the Kabbalistic Tarot, we see this depicted by the Fool card. Now, we know that the Fool card within the Kabbalistic Tarot has the value of the number 0. And within the Hebrew alphabet, or the Hebrew alphabet, the Fool card is corresponding with the Hebrew letter Aleph, which is the first letter within the Hebrew alphabet. So there's this thought that the Fool is representing the first, or the beginning, or the initial of everything. However, when we see the Fool within the Kabbalistic Tarot, he is fully clothed. From the crown of his head to the soles of the feet, the Fool is fully clothed. Now, this is curious because we like to believe that the Fool is meant to represent the individualized human soul entering the material plane. And we also like to believe that the individualized human soul entering the material plane enters the material plane naked. However, the Fool card shows us that this is not the truth. The Fool card shows us that by the time as we're ready to be born in this world of matter, we have already come into this world of matter with a particular vestment, or with a particular set of clothing, or with a particular set of ideas or concepts that we surround ourselves by. So none of us, in stepping out of the stellar shells and down into the womb of our mothers, none of us come into this plane completely naked, because all of us are bringing with us all of the potencies that exist within the cosmos. And what are those potencies? The Corpus Hermeticum tells us that the very first thing that we do as human beings or as human spirits is we pare down into the harmony of the universe. And in paring down into the harmony of the universe, we step down off of the 8 stellar shell of heaven where we exist with God. and we descend through the harmony of the spheres, and as we pass through each sphere, we receive from each sphere some aspect or some element of that planet as a psychic tattoo within the very spiritual DNA of who we are. So the first sphere that we pass through is the sphere of Saturn. And the gift that Saturn bestows onto all of us is the gift of gravity, or the gift of being able to find a sense of direction and a center of gravity within this lifetime. Saturn bestows onto us this gift of having the ability to gather ourselves as an individual entity within the world. As we descend even further down into the sphere of Jupiter, Jupiter bestows upon us this gift of perspective, because Jupiter is meant to be the remedy of Saturn. Because if we were to step into the material world only having the gravitas and the gravity that we've inherited from Saturn, then we would all be crushed under the weight of the heaviness of that gravity, in much the same way as the Titan Atlas is crushed under the weight of the entire universe that he holds on his shoulders. And as human spirits stepping forward into a material incarnation to become human beings, we are meant to be able to find some sense of perspective and still find some sense of spirituality and still find some sense of expansiveness even while we move through this physical vehicle of flesh. On this note, the Corpus Hermeticum describes this physical vehicle of flesh. In Mastering Traditional Astrology on page 43, I write about what Hermes in the Corpus Hermeticum says about this physical body. Hermes writes, "But even under this burden, which is the burden of our physical body, the soul struggles and thinks, though these are not the same kinds of thoughts that it would have if it were detached from the body. Instead of energies, it knows only sensations and passions that proceed from the body." So what Hermes is essentially saying to us is that once we have entered a physical reality, we no longer can experience the energetic constitution of our cosmos in the way that it exists as an ocean of pure, unbridled energy. All we can experience once we get casted into a physical body is the sensations and the emotions and the feelings that arise out of being in this body of flesh. As we move down through the sphere of Jupiter, we move down into the sphere of Mars. And in the sphere of Mars, each of us have this ability and this desire and this burning hunger to be and become. Mars, from a Hermetic perspective, is corresponding with sulfur, which is one of the three substances that exists within the universe, within the context of Western mysticism. Mars and sulfur have to do with that part of nature that desires to grow, that desires to evolve, that desires to eat, that desires to become something different as a result of what it's consuming. So Mars gives us this hunger for achievement, and that achievement might be manifested in terms of the actual work that we're doing within this world, but that achievement is also the achievement to pass from one stage of life into another stage of life, from childhood into adolescence, into adulthood, into old age. The force and the momentum that pushes us from one stage of life into another is that firepower of Mars. Then, as we descend from the sphere of Mars, we descend into the sphere of the sun. And the sun and the purpose of the sun is to individualize each and every one of us as individual beings within this world. Because of the daylight, we can see the difference between one person standing next to another person. In the darkness of night, it becomes very difficult to distinguish clearly the difference between individual entities. So from a metaphysical perspective, the sun is meant to individualize each and every one of us. The sun, from the perspective of Sankhya philosophy, which is one of the philosophical traditions that comes to us out of India, is meant to signify the ahankara. The ahankara within Sankhya philosophy is the I maker, the part of ourselves that has the ability to declare itself an I, individualized and in radiant expression, separate and apart from other entities or beings that exist around it. So within the sphere of the sun, we are gifted this idea of ourselves as individual beings, as individual entities that exists as one individual in juxtaposition to another individual. We are given the gift of our individuality that further on will be expressed as our physical body that distinguishes us from somebody else standing on the side of us. As we descend from the sphere of the sun, we descend into the sphere of Venus. Because all of the processes that we've been given thus far are processes that are only meant to affirm our individuality as individual beings within the world. So far, with all of these masculine planets, we have only developed this idea of ourselves as separate individual beings that exist within the universe. We have not developed a part of ourselves that knows how to be in relation to the other. So, as an act of necessity, we descend further into the sphere of Venus. And in Venus, we learn to love. And in Venus, we learn to loosen something about our individual structure and makeup within this world so that we can be in dialogue with the other, so that we can surround ourselves with a community that represents an extension of our individual beliefs and worldview in the world. Venus gives us the gift of being social creatures and the gift of knowing that we're not here simply to be individual entities separate and apart from the world around it, but Venus gives us the gift of knowing that we're here to be in relation to the other. And more importantly than that, that we are here to love one another. And through the process of loving one another, expand the parameters that define how we define ourselves and also that define how we view ourselves in the world at large. After we pass through the sphere of Venus, we descend downward into the realm and the sphere of Mercury. And in the realm and the sphere of Mercury, we are given the gift of mental acuity and we're given the gift of mental sharpness. And as a result of that mental acuity and sharpness, we know how to navigate the complexities and the challenges of an earthly life. As a result of Mercury, we know how to deal with the puzzles that we find within our human experience. As a result of Mercury, we know how to be thinkers more than doers, because up until this point, we only know how to do. And as a result of that gift of thought, and as a result of that spirit of intellection, we now know how to be thinking beings within the world. And that thought process that we find in Mercury is what distinguishes the human being from other animals around us, because we have the ability not just to be doers, but also to be deciders. And that is the gift of Mercury within each and every one of us, to be able to choose from a sea of complex options that which stands most in harmony with what we desire for ourselves and with what will serve our highest well-being within this world. And finally, after we descend from the sphere of Mercury, we descend into the sphere of the moon. And the moon governs the powers of growth and diminution. The moon governs the powers that causes our physical body to be what it is. The moon governs the foundational history of our ancestors in terms of how our physical body is composed within this lifetime. The moon governs our physiological makeup. The moon governs the plasmic prototype of who we are as individuals within our mother's womb before we actually enter the actual embryo that is in our mother's womb. The moon is our spiritual double. That is the exact replica of our human body. So in a very real sense, the moon is representing our astral double or our etheric body. And after we would have descended into the sphere of the moon, we would have descended there heavy with all of the other pieces of clothing and all of the other gifts of all of the other planets. And that is where we find the Fool within the Kabbalistic Tarot. We find the Fool in the Kabbalistic Tarot after he has already inherited the gifts of the 7 planets, and that is why he is standing on the precipice that he is standing on. Because after inheriting all of that, he's standing on the precipice of descending into the human embryo that is growing within our mother's womb. If the Fool doesn't descend into the human embryo that is growing within our mother's womb, then that embryo will continue to grow like a vegetable within us, but it will never turn into a living being. We need for the Fool to jump off of that precipice with all of the planetary potencies that he carries, and that represents the moment of quickening. That represents the moment of when that embryo turns from just being a growing turnip within your womb to actually being a living, sentient being. And these are the gifts of the planets that we bring into this lifetime. And this is where we begin our understanding of the planet from a traditional astrological perspective.